Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson Friday sat in front of the Chicago Commercial Club and answered questions from a moderator about a whole host of things, from the city's economy to crime and even education. And in particular, Johnson being a former educator, he had some thoughts to share. And interesting to hear him talk about the assessment of a student. And do we look at letter grades anymore? Here's Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson discussing that with the Commercial Club of Chicago on Friday in front of business leaders and civic leaders and so on.
I personally don't give a lot of attention to grades. I don't. And this is not to obfuscate the question. I'll get to my answer here in just about 20 more seconds. That when you have the type of variables that exist within our Chicago public school system, we have to establish a rubric that speaks to the needs as well as the unique dynamics that exist. So we have signed up 1,700 new students who are newly arrivals. We also have a good number of our students, particularly Black students, that disproportionately make up our special education population. And we also have too many of our schools that have not been fully supported and funded. And so for me right now, it's more about establishing the rubric and the criteria of how we're going to judge the system moving forward. But unfortunately, we've had this standardization of our public schools that have sucked out the imagination of our children. So when we talk about arts, when we talk about music, heck, when we talk about having a soccer team or a chess club, I hope you all realize that students don't just show up because they want to discuss the 5 causes of the American Revolution. Now, me and President Preckwinkle, we talk about it all the time. She argues with me. She believes there are 6 causes of the American Revolution. But how do you grade a system when the system has not fulfilled its basic obligation of providing an equitable system that speaks to the needs? And here's why that's important. Public education at the expense of the state, particularly in the South, after all, is a Negro idea. It's W.E.B. Du Bois. And so the very concept and ideal of public accommodations is deeply tethered to the experience and the desire for Black liberation. My responsibility is not simply to just grade the system, but to fund the system. That's how I'm ultimately going to grade whether or not our public school system is working, based upon the investments that we make for the people who rely upon it.
So again, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson not necessarily worried about proficiency and grades of outcomes for students in various subjects. He's looking more at the proficiency in funding. So obviously, Chicago Public Schools costs about, $25,000, $26,000 per student, while you've got some schools in downstate Illinois costing $7,000 or $8,000. On average, it's $16,000 per student in the state to go to a public school. So is it going to take more money for Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson to better grade the quality of education? But it wasn't the only thing he talked about with the Commercial Club of Chicago. He was also asked about crime and how he's getting a handle on that. And in particular, the long-term ideas. Yes, we want to have more constitutional policing. Yes, probably going to have some social workers go to certain calls. Johnson talked about that a bit, and that's a long-term idea. But what about the short term? You look at the headlines, 2 people held at gunpoint. You got the other weekend there were a dozen plus armed robberies. You've got carjackings through the roof. You've got shootings that happen on the regular, not just on the weekends, but practically every day of the week up in Chicago. So what's Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson's action plan on the short term to address crime?
While we're pursuing that in an earnest way, we've got to make progress against the triage of the short term. The detectives' strategy is clear. We're going to solve more of these crimes. Some people believe that beyond that, it's also important to have more patrol officers and deploy them. Tell us a little bit about your policing strategy.
That's a good question, and it's a legitimate concern. This is why I've said repeatedly we have to have smart policing. Here's the problem that we have, not just in Chicago, but the country. We expect policing to do everything. Police officers get calls because someone's 5-year-old doesn't want to go to preschool. I'm not saying that's not a crisis. I'm saying, though, should a police officer be a counselor? We're asking police officers to do too much. Here's the other harsh reality. And more people need to actually say this out loud. Police forces are down all over the country. We have to be smart and thoughtful about the systems that we have inherited will not be the systems that we pass on. And so even when people talk about we need more police officers, it still takes 2 years for that to come into fruition. How immediate is 18 months? How immediate is youth summer jobs? If you had a choice to do something today, that you can make a decision today, you can wait 18 months for people to come through the police academy and have the ability to actually police on their own, or we can put people to work, deal with the housing crisis, create a transportation system and an education system that works for people and good paying jobs. What are you gonna do? You're gonna do those 5 things because we can get them done now. We cannot allow the politics of old to determine and set the trajectory for the future when we've already seen that the politics of old have caused the problems that we are facing today.
So again, he's talking about more funding and getting more officers will take some time, but having the ability to have after-school jobs for kids or more housing grants and things along those lines. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a perspective from the Chicago mayor in questions about education, but also about dealing with crime.